however, not identical to or not reducing to the same kind of complexity that mainstream complexity science is concerned with necessarily. So I'll start out with a bit of background to the work and why we did it. So my group is a complexity science group at Chalmers University of Technology. It has been active since the mid-80s, and I've been there. Well, I've been away in US and Italy and other places since about 95, 96. And we have all the time been embedded as a sort of an enclave in the Department of Energy and Environment, and now Space, Earth and Environment. Quite policy close types of research. And the reason that they have put up with us, really, I would say, is that there is a promise in complexity science that we would have the key to understanding societal systems and social systems. But we were sort of getting irritated both with ourselves and the rest of the complexity community that these promises were just being repeated over again, and there was like less in the shape of delivery, except in particular subsystems like traffic and stuff like that can be simulated and can be like to good effect. But compared with biology, for example, and the physics, where dynamical systems and the theoretical core of complexity science have had a huge impact, and in evolutionary biology and so on, it has a transformative impact. It's hard to say the same for the social sciences. So we were starting to wonder a bit about why this was, and why the attempts at making it more useful by, for example, rich agent-based models and things like that did not really produce what we felt to be very as satisfying results as we had perhaps wanted. Okay, more work is needed, but is it just more work that is needed? I mean, it's quite convenient if you need more funding. I mean, then you have a big promise, and you need to work more on it. But do we need to take some steps back to reflect on things, perhaps? So we started to think about about this from the idea that the sense that when people talk about complex problems, they mean a big range of things, and as we are in sort of the Santa Fe Institute school, where there are lots of different fields that intersect, and when you read something that is about this is complexity is defined, and so on and so forth, everybody seems pretty sure about what it is, but they're sure about very different things, because they look at it from their own angle, and it sort of eludes you what would be at the core of it. So, and when you get to society and policy and these things, there is even more of this colloquial complexity. So what about complexity, and what complexity science is about? Okay, so what does it mean? Okay, say that we were to arrange, to rank different things between simple and complex, and we have a lot of things there that we would maybe say are complex in ways: social, insect, colonies, corporations, traffic, weather, ecosystems, organisms, stuff like that. But it's very hard to say whether an anthill is more or less complex than the weather or a space shuttle, because there are all sorts of different ways of measuring it, and it doesn't make all that much intuitive sense. So it's hard to place things here. but it's not hard in a very instructive or very helpful way. You're comparing apples and oranges you get a very strong sense that you do that. So there are lots of, as I mentioned, lots of different definitions of complexity out there. You have like descriptive complexity and how long is the message you need to minimally need to describe something, and so on and so forth. And the dream, so to say, is to come up with a sort of universal definition that everything reduces to, and you will understand something about it. I think it's complexity is more of a junk category where you throw things that you don't understand. So as we discussed it seemed to us more and more that complex tends to mean that it's overwhelming and I'm not perfectly sure whether, since English isn't my first language, but if it has exactly the right connotations, but it's cognitively overwhelming, that you can't grasp it. It eludes you. Too many degrees of freedom at the same time, for whatever reason. It's complex. And we looked further to what do complexity scientists say about when they describe their own field, what they are doing, which, by the way, is a terrible question to get because you can't come up with a straight answer. I hated that for a long time. So strikingly often, they describe complex as to say it's not complicated. It's complexity is not complicatedness. So there seems to be they sense a need to point this out, that it's not complicatedness. So complexity science seems to be about complex minus complicated. Because in the colloquial, like the space shuttle, we would say it's a pretty complicated system. But it's not about that. It's not about like machines and stuff like that. It's about this dynamical complexity. So we went on to say, okay, maybe there is something here, because complexity and complicatedness, if by complexity we then take this more strict meaning, which would be what the dynamical complexity that complexity science is engaging with, self-organization and emergence and stuff like that. And we have complicatedness. These are two distinct hurdles to our understanding of things. And they correspond to major scientific strategies also. You have engineering and things on one hand that permits us to understand complicated systems and system science and stuff like that. And then pretty recently we have computers to simulate and do things so we can pursue the dynamical complexity also. But these the methodologies are very different from each other. In many ways they are antithetical to each other. There are certain things that bring them together as well, of course. But the idea then was to use this. And so the basic question is then to see these categories. Are they more like a flock of birds? It's not very clear that that's a flock of birds from where you're sitting probably. Or is it more like a space shuttle? And something in between is quite often what you say. They might have tastes of both, but are they mixed like that or like that? They can be mixed. As soon as you don't have an ideal point, then you have the question of how they are mixed, and that's always a lot harder to answer. So what we did then was to try to separate the apples from the oranges by simply taking this axis, the single axis between simple and complex, and breaking it up and opening it up into a plane instead, to see what happens with our examples that we had before. So what happened then? We found was that this relatively or very simple move, which isn't particularly deep in any way, I would say. I think the strength of it, if any, would be that it's not particularly deep, complex and complicated. Anybody, I mean, it's very straightforward what the difference is. So if we plot things in this plane instead, then we get a bit of clustering, and we get separation between what appears to be different categories of systems. And when one starts to think about it, it seems like the clustering is quite logical also. They resemble each other in various ways. And disregarding the simple systems might also, if they are opaque, for example, they might be hard to understand in many ways. But if we disregard that, we see that, okay, we have complex, complicated, that's straightforward, but we also have this new corner up here that emerges. So what to call that? Okay, then it was suggested that this has something to do with the concept of wicked problems. And the more we thought about it, it seems like it really does have something to do with wicked problems. We have yet to formulate completely the idea that innovation can be said to be the generating force behind wicked systems in which we might expect to find wicked problems. So human societies will end up in this corner. Ecosystems under evolution. Now it happens that I have studied both quite a bit, and they macroevolution through major evolutionary transitions resembles innovation as we understand it in societal systems quite a bit. I've organized workshops with macro evolutionary biologists and innovation scholars in the social sciences, and with just a little minor getting used to each other's terminology, they understand each other perfectly well and they can exchange ideas. It's very similar in many respects. So so on evolutionary timescales, on the short timescale, the ecosystem is quite fixed with different species and things like that. It's when you also have the innovation going on in what the species do and how they are related, then it begins to resemble a modern human society in this way, with many differences, of course. Okay, so otherwise it's quite straightforward. You have like weather, traffic, stuff like that, space shuttles, corporations, organisms. I'll get to some more detail towards the end in this diagram. So but the thing is that wickedness then seems not to be easy to understand it as a linear combination between complexity and complicatedness, although we can clearly see that both types of complexity, so to say, or complexity and complicatedness are at work. You see both this organized modular organization of complicatedness in society, but you also have this bottom-up dynamics that is churning the whole time. But it's not particularly easy to pick them apart. And we can also see that the ideas we have for how to deal with the complicated and the complex systems, they haven't worked all that well up towards that corner. There's something that they are missing. So, and I will also encourage questions as I speak. So if there is anything that is unclear, I'd be glad to straighten it out while I'm presenting. So some ideas about them. I think there was distributed 2 papers, I think, that we've written, were they distributed in some way? Sorry, the papers, were they like, I think I have a feeling, I have some recollection that I sent the links or something at some point earlier. I might have done.
As part of your seminar?
Yeah.
Right, I'll just check.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe some of you have seen the papers. That's the point. I don't know otherwise, because it's maybe that can be made available afterwards. Yeah. So because there, of course, I go much more into details and hopefully explain certain things more at depth than I can do right here. So what then is this wickedness? Most of you, I suppose, know. I mean, are familiar with the term wicked problems. That they seem to actively evade solutions, more or less, being solved, more or less. So what happens here, more technically? Okay, you have a low degree of decomposability in society, for example. It has been described as a seamless web, for example, where the subsystems that you can identify have so many cross connections going back and forth between them. So any change in any of the subsystems can travel very quickly to all the other subsystems, which is different from a machine or something where you actively try to prevent this from happening by compartmentalizing and limiting the degrees of freedom, and so you have a high degree of integration in the component and a lot of separation between them. So that doesn't happen here because they're not designed. They emerge in a sort of bottom-up manner. Although from the Enlightenment and onwards we have like to pretend that they are designed to some extent. When we try to model them, we try to do something, then we have this urge to integrate the entire system into the model. So okay, this is not realistic. Okay, we need to add this, and then we need to add that, and then we need to go more into depth, and then sooner or later you have everything in there. And when you have everything in there, you also have lots and lots of assumptions about pretty much everything, and most of these assumptions will be poorly founded and quite arbitrary, and they will all interact. So if the model does what you expect, then you don't learn anything. If it doesn't do what you expect, you can't trust it, which is like the situation of wicked complexity models, rich simulation models. So in some way it's like the game and the rules of the game, they're linked here. Change happens dynamically on similar timescales. So if we we'll see that in the next slide. So I'll get back to that. Okay, poor timescale separation prevents legitimately assuming a constant environment, and then because now we get to what we need to assume in order to study something scientifically, the way that we usually do this. Okay, we like to control the environment to say that these things are constant, or they can be described in simple fashion statistically. So we don't have to worry about them, and now we vary a couple of parameters to figure out what we're doing. And even if we don't do it strictly, if we just do it by a narrative or whatever we do, we like to do something like that. We need to have some sort of firm ground when we do something. If we can do that, then we are usually fine. And if you look at in engineering or something like that, it's pretty much straightforward. We design systems to be precisely like that, because if we don't, we can't handle it. That's why we can build so terribly sophisticated systems. Then if we look at complexity science, all successful models, I would say, that have had a big impact are very simple, and they all have the same basic ontology. It's a micro level with a fixed set of types of agents or components, and that interact in preordained ways that are defined, the types of ways that they are defined on beforehand. And then you run it, you let them interact, and you observe on the macro level, you observe the patterns that arise. By doing this, you are getting through the thickets of the dynamical system of the emergence, which we have cognitively can't see through. We're extremely poor at doing that. So it solves a very big problem, but it does really only solve one problem. And we still need to make these basic scientific assumptions about constants in the system and everything. So we can't. It doesn't let us get away from the need to have a timescale separation between what we observe and what we are looking at. So in the wicked system, what will happen then is that, and this is done exploratively also in complexity science, which can be interesting in various ways, like artificial life simulations, where you have the rules of the game changes by evolution while the simulation is running, and it becomes inventive and comes up with all sorts of things endogenously. It's very hard to strictly use it for something, but you can look at certain phenomena, but usually you don't do that. So it's interaction between known entities within a known environment. Simple systems, of course, we don't even have to think that much about. They only have a limited number of degrees of freedom. So wickedness is really when this cannot be done. And I might add the qualification that it is an adaptive system. We haven't really connected it to various types of systems that are not adaptive in a way, like various natural systems. I would say that we have turned out to be, I don't know if this is an anthropic principle at work, that otherwise we wouldn't be here to talk about it, but it seems like we're lucky that there is quite a bit of time scale and length scale separation between specific levels of organization that lets things happen in between them, like between how the different forces operate and so on. So wickedness in that sense is when this cannot be done. So looking then into methodologies, just to verify a little bit that what we have in these different domains. Starting out here, system theory, engineering, cybernetics, organization theory, ecology, stuff like that, are based on systems on ontology, where we typically have a large number of types of entities that interact in very specific and fixed ways, either in designed ways, like in a computer, or in evolved ways, like in an organism, for example. There's more in the papers, and the links will then be distributed. There are lots of more ways of characterizing this type of system. They seem to be top-down designed, all of them, that the internal parts do not compete and undermine one another. So you don't get a competition between the spark plugs and the car, for example. The spark plugs can't gain by undermining the function of the car. But if we move up towards to add more complexity to something complicated, like in an agency or any human organization where you put together sort of a machine with humans, then you do get the possibility that the parts start to undermine the function of the whole, because their interests might not be entirely aligned. And that's of course a big problem that is, you can really see how it has been solved time after time in biology, and we can see in organizations that there are functions specifically dedicated to solving this problem, and there is a lot of energy and effort being spent at maintaining the alignment within, and it really limits the sizes of the organizations that you can build. So, and toward complexity, well, then we have all this agent-based modeling and all of that. Then, when we move towards the wicked, of course, we have, well, social science, more quantitative social science. It ends up, I mean, analytical models and system-based stuff, and also with an interest in complexity science. So it partakes in all of these basic methodologies. But then we have the humanities, which then goes into the narrative way, which is close to how we cognitively and intuitively perceive our social environments. And so we have this in the last slide also, but I will. Our idea here is that we have a way of we have cognitive capabilities of understanding wicked systems up to a point, and that point is pretty well bounded by something which you have probably heard of, the Dunbar's number, the maximum size of a group where you can know everybody and you can figure out what is going on. It's in quite small groups. Then you can keep track of all these things, that this person knows that person, they don't like each other, and that person did something there, so that person has probably changed its opinion of that, and you can keep track of all of these things going on. But when you blow that up to a country or something like that, then there's just no way of keeping track of everything that's going on. So the narrative theory in the humanities, they are forced to taking particular perspectives on society, so they can just take one snapshot at a time. They seem never to be able to capture it all. When they do, they bring out something, but they always have to miss something at the same time. And traditionally, that's how they have, operated also. That you have to have a plurality of perspectives that have to coexist and interact the whole time to sort of over time integrate a more full picture of what is going on. So what do we have up there? Yeah, we'll get to some of that. We must deal with the wicked, of course, because it's very important types of problems going up there. Had it not been the case, then we might just have not done it. Just say that we can't study it scientifically, so let's not do it, or something like that. But there are reasons apart from that. It's a nice challenge to do it. There are many good reasons for trying to do as well as we can. Two strategies that have been used to illustrate the troubles or the problems of doing this. One is I've called transplantation and selectivity. We'll get to what this means. And the other is making our methods themselves more wicked. Okay, so transplantation. Okay, that is that we, as I was touching upon before, with narrative theory, we take the wicked system and we project it onto our methodologies. Quite often, when we discover a way of doing this, like say with systems theory, half a century ago, and more operations research and all of these things. The enthusiasm was very high. Finally, we would really deliver on this dream from the Enlightenment that we would design a society that would be better and that would be suited for human well-being and everything like that. And the term, I mean, the concept of wicked problems comes right out of a critique from the inside of this highly modernistic system science way that, well, maybe it doesn't really work to do this in all cases. It's probably not going to solve all the problems we have, and it's probably going to cause a lot of problems at the same time. And sure enough, it has done so. So then the enthusiasm peters out. The tradition doesn't go away because it's still useful in various ways. So, but nobody thinks it's going to like save us anymore. The same has been like with economics, and then complexity science was sort of the same thing. That suddenly we can understand this dynamics and the dynamical aspects of it, which systems-based theories have problems doing. And then that sort of also stagnates and doesn't make as much headway as it promised and was hoping for. And then, of course, I mean, then we have various mixes, but I think you can find them in Europe and not least in the UK. There is more of the tradition of beginning from like Prigozhin and so on. We're beginning from the systems perspective and going towards the complexity side. Yes.
Does this connected dots from narrative theory and analytical models mean that these two together somehow suitable for handling wicked problems? Is it? Or wicked systems?
They mean.
Why did you do them? Why did you connect them?
So this represents that attempts at understanding this system by casting it as a complicated system. Here, you cast it as the complex system, and that's the funny thing. It's worth to remark about, because if you read some book by somebody who's enthusiastic about systems theory, for example, they can make a very convincing case and about how you can understand society in this way, and it makes all sense in the world. Then you read something by a complexity scientist, and you'll be equally impressed by that. So for some reason, you can make both stories, and it's hard to really tell which one is more convincing. They're convincing at the same time. So it really, I think, that displays how you can put the complexity filter on society, and then it looks like a complex system, and then you can put a complicatedness filter on it, and it will look like a complicated system. So everyone can feel that they're right about this. And you can even make a case for simple analytical models, because you can find regularities that are perfectly well predicted by simple economic models, and to say everything else is noise. And if you just go to big enough timescales, you can often make a case for that. Some others will say that no, you have to tell historical narratives about what happens, and sure enough, certain things are. I mean, try to model the history of an innovation history, for example. Can't do that yet. It's a dance of various very discrete contingent events that happen to come together. So you have to tell a story about it. Otherwise, so that's what I'm trying to just illustrate here. So it's just like an illustration of how it has been attempted to go to these different to use the different methods that we have and that we know work. Try to imagine that the wicked system is really down there, or is really over there, and that it hasn't worked all the way.
ask a
Yeah.
question?
Hmm?
I can think of lots of systems that are complicated but not complex.
Yeah.
I can't think of any systems that are complex but not complicated.
Ah,
You've
yeah.
got an example of something that's complex but not complicated.
Yes, but that's good because there are lots of things like this that can be discussed. I have the same problem a little bit. You can say, for example, a flock of birds. I would place in the complex end of the spectrum, because there you have all the organization you have is very ephemeral. It just exists, and if the birds stop, the patterns go away. So there's no persistence in it in any way. Certain parts of society will be all the way down there, like traffic, for example. There you have the road network. Over the time scale of a day, the road network and the traffic regulations and everything are perfectly constant. So you can assume them, you can just set them up and everything. And the cars also happen to constrain the way that we can act in a way that makes us very predictable and easy to simulate. And sure enough, traffic simulations are among the most successful application of complex systems methodologies that have been actually useful. So it happens in this case that it conforms to these rules. But then again, almost all interesting complex systems, they do have aspects of complicatedness in them. And let me get back to that very shortly, because I have a slide right at the end. So I might be able to satisfy that a little bit there. So I'll just say a little bit here about this other way of doing it, making our methods more wicked, which is usually comes under the label of making the models more realistic, meaning that you add a lot of new stuff to it, which is has been a big industry, and I think with questionable success. I mean, you can always find certain aspects of success, but from the basis of complex systems models, agent-based models and stuff like that. Okay, then you have these descriptive simulations, and I've worked, for example, with urban growth models and the urban and regional dynamics and stuff like that, which I work with it a little bit now also, but I worked mostly with it in the beginning of the 2000s, when you would use cellular automata, for example, and geographers would add more and more rules and things, and the idea was to make it into sort of a geographical expert system that would animate the expert knowledge of the geographers and the other experts who would know about other subsystems, and you would be able to run this and figure out what would happen if you change something or if something happens. It has been used in a lot of different ways, and they have probably acted upon it, but planners don't use it to any big degree today. They don't use any models really to any large degree. I have an industrial PhD student who is meaning that he is employed somewhere and doing his PhD at the same time. So he's employed at the Traffic Road Administration in Sweden, so where he's a senior analyst. So he knows this world very well, and he says that basically you run the model, and if it says what you like, then you use it, otherwise you don't use it. So and it enters late in the planning process, and you don't trust it. So we're trying to build models that go into the planning practice better, but that's an aside. So adding stuff doesn't really work very well, and I was touched upon that a little bit in the beginning. That why? Because the assumptions that you have to make, they compound. You have to use empirical data that may come in different formats. You may not understand exactly how they were collected and exactly what they were about, and then you have to sort of cobble them together and interface them with each other. And in the end, it's quite hard to tell what's going on. And I have a favorite story that also gets in a little bit of the merits of trying out simple predictors or comparing with simple predictors. It's a quite famous model of let's see, it would be early Neolithic settlements in the American Southwest, the Anasazi model. It was quite a big effort at the Santa Fe Institute, who put together a lot of different sources of data on with high resolution that became available with the precipitation and various indicators of vegetation and all sorts of things across a couple of hundred years, when the Anasazi people had abandoned see if I have it right, if they abandoned the mesatops, I think, and moved into the valleys, or if it was the other way around. It's unimportant. And it was seen as a very, like a big success, because they managed to reproduce the pattern very well. A couple of years later, Marco Jansen at Arizona State now, he just published a paper where he used one of the data sets on precipitation, I think, or whichever it was, and managed to, with a very simple model, get exactly the same results out. So that's also something that you can't pick out. You build something big, and then you don't even know if you need the whole thing. Integrated assessment modeling. I mean, it's the same thing. You start more from the system-based things, that you have these various subsystems and you interface them with each other, and you try to come up with something. And who knows? Usually they're used for making scenarios into the future. So who knows if they work? But it's quite convenient that they can't be tested. I'm not saying that they're completely useless because of that. And actually one reason, which is a tough reason, because you have to believe in it for this reason to apply, is that while you work on putting together a very complex model like this, you do learn a lot about the system and you bring people together to learn about it together. So the project of putting it together has always, for me, been worth more than actually running the thing afterwards. So you can just do it and then throw it away. So it's and then of course for games and stuff like that, but that's a different story. Well, in fact, it might not be, because you might use different, not realistic, but representative systems in game-like settings for example, building intuition for how something works, or for visualizing something, making people acquainted, like children, students, etc. How do things work? How does the system respond to? Because the qualitative features of the system might be in there, even if it's not realistic. What happens if I do something? Can you learn something from playing games that will? I think you can. It's a so there is some potential in that. But anyhow, if there are no questions about this one further, and we can take questions afterwards as well, I'll move to a bit about empirical strategies. See what to say here. Okay, so just to note that there are. You can also see that there are different types of data that comes in that from these different directions. Things that emanate directly from the wicked end and from the low in the wicked end. Stories about various things. It's very hard to use this data precisely because it's historical and very entangled, and it goes back and forth, and you have no idea what the involved entities are or anything like that. And it changes the whole time, and something enters and something exits. So with natural language processing, you can do a little bit of that, but typically, I have a former student who works with this. The quantitative people, they usually use just very simple word recognition and phrases and stuff like that, because you can do that on large amounts of data. What you really would like to do would have to use methods that are used for penetrating the text much deeper, but then of course it's a problem because you need a lot of computation to do that. This is like the large amount of data that are pouring over us right now. Brings out something else, at least complex systems, small number of types. You don't have a lot of types usually of entities. It might be humans, they all act in the same way in the model. Or you assume that they do in behind the data, because you only measure a certain number of parameters or variables. And then the magic happens in the interactions, so to say. Whereas if you have a complicated system, it's the other way around, so to say. You have lots of different types of entities and often lower volumes of data. But I think I'll move to the last slide because it answers some of the... this is pretty small, unfortunately. So I don't think you can read it, can you? No. So I'll have to point and say it, and maybe if you know what's there, you might be able to read it. Okay, the simple systems. This is in the 2016 paper, so which hopefully will be distributed the links to these papers. We subdivide this spectrum into a number of subtypes, which we think can be described in various ways. So we take away these and say that these are simple systems here. Okay. So let's take this. Okay, you have the complex ones, which would be an ideal category of things like flocks and traffic and stuff like that. But as I said then, most systems of interest actually have a bit of complicatedness in them, especially since we're interested in various adaptive systems, if it's social or if it's biological. Because when this dynamics happens, and you have an evolution or a design of the behavior of the agents, then these patterns in themselves become persistent, and they will stick around and they will affect the dynamics further on. So you get a bit of complicatedness inside of this. We can take social behavior of animals, for example. They are typically pretty hardwired, so for example we can take old world monkeys or something like that. Okay, they're group dynamics. Since it's they're related to us, but have a different way of organizing. So there you will have something that is entirely generated from just a genetically hardwired behavior. Okay, so it's matrilocal, so the female stays in the same place and the males migrate. So they have a dominance hierarchy where the daughters get slotted in right below the mother in the hierarchy. Because the others observe that she cares for this person. That means that it's right below her in rank. And then they have to keep sorting this out the whole time to redetermine how they should be sorted. And they can manage to do that up to a certain group size. They groom and they fight and do all sorts of things. When they're done grooming and fighting, they always return to the same structure again. When it gets below above a certain size, it becomes unstable. They can't restore it, and then it splits into two, and you get two groups instead. So here I was just describing a couple of macroscopic features of this, which will place it up into what I call the trans-complex, which is going beyond complex up towards the complicatedness a little bit. We're approaching the wicked because we start to get aspects of complicatedness into it. So I would say that most systems of interest would actually be up towards trans-complex, and the ideally complex one would be like particle systems in physics or something like that, where the components would be very, very simple. So going from complicated towards the trans-complicated can be hard to tell these apart. Sometimes I have noticed, but in any case, so complicated. Okay, there we have things like say computer or something. We've designed it to in a modular fashion and everything, and so nothing competes within it or anything like that. And then we got the idea that we could design sort of machines made out of partly out of human components, which would be organizations. They're older institutions, are much older than that, but they're more self-organized. They're evolutionarily organized in a different way. So there you certainly suddenly you have an inherent problem of defection going on the whole time. So you have to keep things in line. And you can see that in organisms as well. You have the immune system constantly fighting to get malfunctioning cells to get them out of the system, because otherwise you will have evolution starting to happen between the cells within the body, which then becomes cancer. So you have to keep it out. What one can see in marginal cases of multicellular organisms, like Volvox colonies, for example, how you have primitive additions to the repertoires of single cellular amoebas in place to have them get along better and say that, okay, you're of this type, so you get to procreate while we do other things, and it doesn't matter all that much because we're all so closely related. So multicellularity has arisen a good number of times because of that. It's quite easy transition to make. So that's that sort of movement. The sub-wicked is then interested because it's like the wicked, like our big societies, but it's less of it, and we can intuitively grasp it. Our small-scale societies and our small-scale communities that we are part of. Chimpanzee communities would be the only animal counterpart that actually resembles it, for good reasons. We're only 7.5 million years separated from them. We share the same community structure, or well, we don't, but extant and historical hunter-gatherers do. So-called fission fusion style of organizations that wolves also have, when you want to cover a large territory, but you don't want to put too much weight on it, and you want to be able to defend it at the same time. So we have the same way of organizing. As long as we're mobile, we do that. The chimpanzees, they only have one level of organization below the community. They only have the foraging parties that form and dissolve the whole time, hence the fission fusion. Humans, there you have an intermediate camp level as well, where the groups congregate every night and go out. But they're very similar, and you can infer that we have had this way of organizing ever since we crossed paths last time with the chimpanzees. So it's actually something that we share for genealogical reasons. because of these things, chimpanzees have been much more studied in the wild over the past decade or two, and it's well understood now how, I mean, they have literally hundreds of cultural traditions. They're not integrated into a cultural system in the same way as with humans, but you can still see that they stick out from the rest in the same direction as humans, but not as much. They are also not organized along the lines of biological kinship as the old world monkeys are, for example, but by negotiation the whole time. They are constantly maintaining these alliances and keeping it up, but there is nothing to return to. There is no ground zero that they can return to. No, like with the dominance hierarchy in the old world monkeys. You can't return to this, so they will split for other reasons, and so they behave in similar ways. So we have a type of a way of organizing that seems to be unique for our own lineage, so to speak, that leads up to something that is extremely hard to understand, because there is no. I think the thing is that we have never understood our society since we have never designed them. So they are traditional things that just come from it. It's something very recent that we try to design our societies, which with mixed success. So to say, and we're sort of mixing up our capability of designing our tools and the smaller things with a capability of understanding what society really does. So we can build a society without understanding it. So building it doesn't necessitate an understanding of it. So that's why we can build something that we have no idea how it works, and we have very big problems controlling it in a fail-safe way. So pretty much because as soon as you do something, somebody else will react to what you have done, and they will do something back, and you have no idea, and this will just propagate around and all churns around at the same time. And it's not just that you get a dynamical system, you also get qualitative novelty the whole time. So suddenly the rules of the game have changed. Somebody came up with something new, like computers or something like that, and things just go on like that. So just some ideas that aren't particularly worked through, but we think it's a bit interesting to do mappings like this. Would need quite a bit of more work, really. Okay, so how they arise. Okay, you can't read this probably. So how do they arise? Okay, complex systems and up to transcomplex systems. Okay, there we have self-organization, interacting entities that interact and create patterns that might be adaptive or might not be adaptive. So the wicked systems generated by what we might call as a collective term innovation. So that qualitative novelty, that something is cognitively reacting the whole time and trying to outsmart something else or outperform something else, like in ecosystem evolution and in societies. Complicated systems, they arise by design assembly. So they are assembled from the bottom up. I don't think this is entirely true, what I've written there, in fact. But a lot of them are, we assemble complicated systems, having to do with that. To do this, you need a very protected environment. You need to be able to ensure that the right factors are in place and that they can be put together in the same in a very exact way, and the system doesn't need to function wholly while you're doing it. It would be very hard if you had to build a car. If you built a car and it had to function the whole time, that would be very hard. But self-organized systems, they don't really have an assembly phase or anything like that. They just come into being, and if it stops, they just go away. And same thing with society. It has no beginning. You can't. You can always go further back. So governed. Okay, you have something resembling herding in complex systems. You have to like push the system a little bit. You have to affect the behavior of the agents and make them do various things, because you can't affect them all at the same time. There's no centralized control. In the wicked system, where there you have something like negotiation, because you have to convince and get along, and you have to as in negotiation, you try a process to find out the agendas and the ends and the means that are available, and try to piece something together. And then you have control in the complicated system, because everything will behave as designed. So bottom up versus top down, and the combination of bottom up and top down at the same time. So organization, a dynamical hierarchy in the case of the complex system, a static hierarchy in the case of the complicated system, and a seamless web in the case of the wicked system. You have crisscrossing interdependencies going back and forth the whole time. The risk with the complicated system is that they break down. They're sensitive to, if you destroy a component of them, that they will just cease to function. You can make them a little bit robust, but it's very hard to make them robust. In the complex system, the chaos is the big villain the whole time, which causes them to be unpredictable. Small disturbances will amplify very quickly. And in the wicked system, you have something called ontological uncertainty. You never know what's out there. You don't even know what components exist in the system. You have no way of knowing that, and it can, if you do, it can change at any time. So yeah, and the last one is more sociological, in fact. So this was the last slide. So yeah, why not? Yeah, why not? So if we have to like get out.